Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, the Northern Lights in Science and Legend, presented by Nat Hab Expedition Leader Eddy Savage. Thank you so much for being here today, Eddy. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here, of course, for another webinar. I think the last one I did was about 2.5 months ago, back in August, on spirit bears. A lot has happened between then and now, but super excited to talk about one of my favorite trips and one of my favorite phenomenons on this planet, the Northern Lights. But before I dive into anything else, I just need to take a quick picture here of how many people have tuned in. 550 people. Holy smokes. That's pretty good. I'm pretty excited about that. I just got to share that with all my friends to let them know what I'm doing in this period of non-guiding. This time of year, of course, you know, we're all travelers and we're all supposed to be, you know, off in different corners of this earth, exploring and learning and traveling and experiencing new things. I would be in Churchill this time of year doing polar bear expeditions, but that's of course not happening, unfortunately. So a little bit about myself. I've been an expedition leader with Nat Hab since 2016. In 2016, I started doing their polar bear trips, and then shortly after I started doing their Northern Lights trips, also in Churchill, Manitoba, and then continued on, started doing their China trips in 2017 as well, and then their Churchill summer trips with the beluga whales, which is also fantastic. And I've been kind of doing a cycle of all those trips now for 4 years, and just last year I started doing their wild Switzerland trips in the summertime in Switzerland, in the Alps, which is quite nice. So something that was really fun for me is, you know, I grew up in Canada, but I grew up in you know, probably not the most stereotypically Canadian place in British Columbia. I'm down on Vancouver Island, kind of the same area as Seattle, not very far north, actually quite far removed from the Northern Lights. And the very first time that I saw the Northern Lights was actually on my first polar bear season, during my first polar bear season, heading out, and we just had one lucky clear night during that season, and the clouds parted and Northern Lights came out, and I was immediately hooked. It was quite an experience. There's nothing quite like the Northern Lights in this world, and something that I'll come back to quite often in this presentation is that it is what I refer to as nature's most beautiful phenomenon. So with that, I'm just going to dive right in. Away we go. Oh, that didn't work. Just got to get set up here. There we go. Got that slide. So this is a nice winter picture here. So by the way, all of the shots of Northern Lights are mine from Nat Hab trips. I've done about 20 of these expeditions now, which is quite a lot. It gives me a lot of nights, 20 expeditions for Northern Lights specifically. That gives me a lot of nights out there looking for Northern Lights. So, you know, these pictures kind of reflect some of the best nights that I've had over the last 4 years, and they're not necessarily representative of one trip. Although you never know, you could get lucky and get all those things. So Northern Lights, to me, I mean, this presentation, I'm going to explain a little bit about the science and then move into legends and myths surrounding it, because something I often go to with Northern Lights is, you know, yes, we can look up into the sky and say, oh wow, yeah, look at all of those charged particles coming in from the sun and interacting with molecules of oxygen and nitrogen in the Earth's upper atmosphere between 60 miles and 200 miles above the Earth's surface. Wow, that's really pretty. It doesn't really have the same ring to me as kind of something more magical, and I really like to kind of think that way and understand what our ancestors from all around the world kind of thought, you know, with the absence of science, with the absence of that scientific understanding of what these could be, and the stories that come from it are really, really cool. So I look forward to sharing some of that with you in a bit. But what I'm going to start with is we're going to start kind of with the scientific discovery, or the first scientific descriptions. Then we'll move through, and then I'll give you a really solid kind of layman's term description of what the Northern Lights are, and then at the end we'll finish with some stories of the legends of the Northern Lights. So away we go. So like I was saying, you know, solar wind, charged particles, etc. Reaches the Earth, interacts with our magnetosphere, and then comes and interacts with our Earth's upper atmosphere. That's very simple. I'll get more into that, but that's what we know now. But you know, let's go back to Aristotle's time. So Aristotle's time, there was a lot of different descriptions. Something that Aristotle said, you know, this is like 2,400 years ago, is that it could purely be just gases, gases and fire in the sky. There's also, you know, and there was kind of this attempt to scientifically describe it back then, and they didn't really have a way of measuring anything, but still pretty interesting to say that, you know, that long ago there was people looking into the sky and saying, okay, you know, that's what it could be. What's interesting about Aristotle is there's a small possibility that he could have actually seen the Northern Lights, but most likely it was just from stories that he'd heard from travelers that had been to more northern areas. But still, that's one of the first kind of true descriptions of the Northern Lights, was kind of these fires or chasms in the Earth's crust, releasing gases into the Earth's upper atmosphere. That was kind of the first attempt at a scientific description, causing fires in the atmosphere and that kind of stuff, or up in the clouds. Now, also on this slide, you'll see that there's, on the right-hand side, there's kind of these two figures that look like they're dancing together. I'll come back to that, but this is what's called a dancing goat, or dancing goats. The slides aren't working very well. So the first records from China came from about 208 BC. And the record kind of goes like this. During the night, luminous clouds were seen, gold and white, with long streamers which lit up the hills. Some say that it is heaven's sword, but others think that it is a deep hole with a large blazing fire in the sky. So again, 2,200 years ago, you know, we're still thinking it's some kind of fire in the sky. And I chose this picture for this description because to me, it kind of, the Northern Lights in this image, they do kind of look like a fire in the sky. You know, that could be, you know, if you had no other option or no other way to describing it, that could certainly be fire in the sky. And there's another really interesting record from China as well. Now, let's move a little bit farther forward in history, and we're talking the 15th century. There was kind of this intellectual movement in the 15th century where a lot of individuals, a lot of people dedicated their lives to basically scientifically describing things. And some of the theories that came, you know, something I always wonder is, you know, did that guy's hair have anything to do with his ability to see the Northern Lights? But some of the theories that came from the 15th century were it was reflections of ice crystals. So they, you know, by this point there had been some exploration and they had a good idea that the farther north you go, the colder it gets, and that the Northern Lights were just simply reflections of ice crystals super high up in the atmosphere, and it was the sun or fires or something, you know, over the horizon that were reflecting off these ice crystals and giving us this glorious light. There's another theory that it's the gases from underneath Greenland's ice sheet. There was, you know, back then there was this idea that there was basically a large, you know, body of iron underneath Greenland's ice sheet. And when the ice cracked open, gases would be released into the sky, and that would give you this color in the sky, these Northern Lights. Not quite though. So moving a bit farther forward, I love this one. You know, at the same time that we're looking at you know, people intellectually trying to describe the Northern Lights, there were also people that were trying to recreate them on land, and this is, you know, or recreate them kind of in a lab environment. And this one came from an artist and also some intellectuals at the time. They took a dark box, and this is a drawing that I found in an old book from, I think, written in the 70s or the 80s, kind of studying historical Northern Lights events and discoveries. But they took a dark box, they drilled a hole or put a hole in one side so that the outside light could shine through. Then that beam of light was directed at a prism, and then the prism light, because it broke apart into different colors, then the prism light hit a glass, and in that glass it was filled with cognac, and then the prism light would shine through the cognac, these gases that were kind of being emitted from the cognac, and create a dancing array of colors and swirls on the board behind. So that was like one of the first attempts at recreating what the Northern Lights were. Not quite, eh? Maybe, but not quite. Would have been fun to see. And so as we move forward, we're going to just fast forward a few hundred years here. Kind of research didn't get very far, but by the 1800s, there was kind of an idea that the Northern Lights certainly had something to do with electricity, or there's a lot of energy involved in them. And on August 28th in 1859, there's what's described as the Carrington event, which is the largest recorded aurora event in Earth's history. Recorded is the key word there. There may have been bigger ones in the past, such as being in China, being able to see the Northern Lights, but the Carrington event in particular was quite a large one. So I'm gonna read you some things. I've just got some notes on this. I want to read you some things from this. So this event, actually, sorry, I'll be reading from the next slide, I think. Yeah. So during the Carrington event, Northern Lights were seen as far south as Cuba, if you can imagine that. There would have been such an immense amount of energy thrown at the Earth and interacting with our Earth's magnetosphere, which I'll get into in a bit, that the Northern Lights would have pushed as far south as Cuba. They would have been seen all over the continental United States. Many regions throughout Europe and Asia would have had the Northern Lights if they had a clear sky. What's really interesting is during this time too, that you can see the quote there were strong currents of electricity observed on the wires to which no batteries were attached, and some extraordinary electrical phenomena, difficulty of explanation noticed. So that event actually put enough electricity, the Aurora event put enough electricity into telegraph wires on Earth that they could still send and receive messages without any battery attached, without any power source attached. It was creating enough energy on the Earth's surface that you could use those things during that time. So this is kind of where the mind started to turn towards, okay, where's this energy coming from? Kind of in a grand scheme of things. So I like to mention this one too. The United States Civil War. So there's another little piece of this whole story, which is that during that Carrington event, it caused a lot of damage that today probably would have cost upward of $1.5 billion to repair within kind of the telegraph lines and whatnot. But being a visible event all over the United States during that time in 1859, there's a lot of different things going on in regard to political movements. In that period of time, sorry, I just got to switch my slide here. In that period of time, there's an entire kind of generation of people that were exposed to these dancing lights all over North America, and with no scientific explanation, you know, one can only assume what may have been thought about these dancing lights in the sky. And so this piece of art that you're seeing here with a man kind of hiding with a pistol and then soldiers dancing in the sky, it is not an unfamiliar scene or an unfamiliar conversation at that time. You know, Northern Lights events like this depicting soldiers marching in the sky, it could have been an omen. And so I actually stumbled across this this entire paper that discussed the omens of the Aurora and the American Civil War. And I just want to read a couple of the excerpts from a few newspapers. So this one is from the Charleston or South Carolina Mercury newspaper. Aurora Borealis, this wonderful phenomenon, was exhibited on Thursday night of last week in all the brilliancy ascribed to it in the polar regions. The article then reports that the town bell was rung as citizens ran through the streets shouting, "Day of Judgment and End of Time." So science wasn't quite caught up there, and people still associated these northern lights kind of with the Day of Judgment. There's another one here that recounts that one person thought it was a harbinger of the dissolution of the Union and war between the North and the South. And as the streams of lights seem to pass from a point in the northwest and northeast up towards zenith, they argued that the South would be victorious in the struggle. So looking at the northern lights in the 1850s and saying, "Yep, this happened, so this is how I'm going to predict the victor of the north, between the North and the South." Now, we're all familiar, most likely, with the author Herman Melville, the author of Moby Dick. And I just want to read you a poem that he wrote in 1865. This is actually after the Civil War, in regard to the Aurora Borealis. The title is Aurora Borealis, and it's a metaphorical reflection on the wartime course of events. So I'll just read this to you. What power disbands the northern lights after their steely play? The lonely watcher feels an awe of nature's sway, as when appearing he marked their flashed uprearing, in the cold gloom, retreatings and advancings, like dallyings of doom. Transitions and enhancings and bloody ray, the phantom host has faded quite, splendor and terror gone, portent or promise and gives way to pale, meek dawn. The coming, going, alike in wonder showing, alike the god decreeing and commanding, the million blades that glowed, the muster and disbanding, midnight and morn. So it was not just this really great event or really amazing thing to see. It influenced an entire generation, with kind of the colors and or basically with the art and the stories and the movements that came from that gigantic Aurora event. So let's fast forward a few years and get into some of the more serious attempts. Really, as researchers got closer and closer to understanding what the Aurora Borealis actually was. A lot of the research actually came from Norway back in the late 1800s. They were kind of one of the foremost auroral researchers. They're in a very good spot to do that. You have to go quite far north, not nearly as far north, much farther north than Churchill would be, to get into the area where you see aurora on a regular basis, around 70 degrees north. But let's talk about some of the early attempts. So this is one of my favorite researchers when it comes to the Aurora Borealis. The man in the picture, his name is Christian Birkeland, and he has been nominated for 7 Nobel Prizes because of his work on Aurora Borealis, understanding the aurora. As well, he did quite a number of other things that I'll get into to help that. But our true scientific understanding of the Northern Lights, and he was Norwegian, our true understanding of the Northern Lights, or at least the beginning to truly understand them, really didn't come around till the turn of the century, in like 1890s and the early 1900s. There was a lot of different researchers going out and trying to figure out what this was at that time. Now, Christian Birkeland had the notion that outside of the Earth's atmosphere, there was essentially this energy, or these particles that were being thrown towards Earth from the direction of the sun. And he figured that the Earth as well had its own kind of magnetic field or magnetic pulses, something that had been well understood with the invention of the compass, that compass points north, so and kind of the usage of magnets. He also really liked to play with electricity. He invented a way to Christian Birkeland invented an electric-powered cannon that he tried to sell to the Norwegian government to help fund his Aurora research. But when he was doing that, I was reading the book. It said that the test run was a failure. Well, it was successful, but it caused a fault which created a huge spark. It worked, but also scared every single person that was watching it, to the point where they said, nope, this isn't going to work. He also utilized hydroelectric power to help draw phosphorus from the atmosphere and basically turn phosphorus or sell phosphorus into a fertilizer for the kind of the boom of the agricultural era at the late 1800s and early 1900s. So he was quite busy, and the money from that and the companies that he had doing that all went towards his Aurora research. So he was definitely a fanatic. He came up with a 900 or so page report right around the turn of the century again on his theories around the Aurora Borealis. But what we're looking at in this picture is an example of one of the first kind of recreations of the Northern Lights. So that box that's got the ball inside of it is called a Torella machine. Huge amounts of electricity are basically shooting inside the box. It's a vacuum. I should mention that there's no air in there, and they're shooting electrons at this magnetized or highly magnetized ball. That magnetized ball is meant to describe or meant to represent Earth, and then the electrons that are flying towards it are meant to represent the solar wind, flying through a vacuum, the vacuum of space, and then interacting with the Earth's magnetic field. So he was actually able to recreate kind of the crown on the top and the crown on the bottom of the ball with the magnetic fields. It's not an exact replica of what the Northern Lights are, but he kind of proved that just by using a magnetized ball, he could kind of position where the electrons would end up touching on the ball. So pretty cool thing that he did there. So he also was one of the leading researchers who discovered how high the Northern Lights are. So this is actually a picture of one of his research cabins, which, so we have to remember that nobody knew how high the Northern Lights were in the 1800s. We know today that they're 60 to 200 miles off the Earth's surface, but the way of thinking back then was to climb up a mountain and get as close as you could to the Northern Lights. So I think the mountains they picked were about 3,500 or 4,000 feet high in the mountains, kind of in northern Norway. And they built these huts out of stone where they lived for the winter, observing the magnetic inflections of the Northern Lights, but also trying to triangulate with another research station that was on another mountain over the way, trying to triangulate the height. And so they built these. They discovered how high they were, and they also realized that, well, we probably didn't need to be high up on this mountain. But the research they did there was really important. Christian Birkeland also coordinated with multiple research groups across the globe by mail, requesting them to basically, if they saw the Northern Lights, use a magnetometer to kind of document, when it's happening, what time it's happening, how much kind of a magnetic change there is, and then send the results back to him. And so he was also kind of one of the main people that discovered that the Aurora Borealis happens more frequently, in a certain band. It's what's now called the Van Allen's belt, or the Aurora belt, basically. But it happens much more frequently, kind of in a tight band across the northern parts of the Earth. And of course, we now know it also happens nearly in a mirror image on the southern side of the Earth, which I'll tell you that. I'll talk about that in a bit. So really interesting guy, and this is just a great picture. He's Northern Lights and Christian Birkeland, but he certainly is not short on history and stories with this man. He dedicated his entire life to studying the Aurora Borealis. All those inventions, the electric cannon, the phosphorus kind of pulling from the atmosphere and selling it. Those were all efforts to basically just make money so he could study the Northern Lights. So he traveled, he basically spent time up north doing that. And once he kind of had a good handle on it, he then went south towards Egypt and studied there's a light phenomenon that happens down there. I've lost the name of it right now, but he was studying that in Egypt as well. And he ended up going to Japan kind of later in his life and studying it there. He died, I think he was nearly 40 or not even 40 when he died under suspicious circumstances in Japan, but that's unfortunate. So here's a guy who's dedicated who dedicated his life to discovering what the Northern Lights are. And now you know who he is, Christian Birkeland. So those discoveries, like I was saying, this on the left, you can kind of see the breakdown. You've got the Earth down below, between at about 60 miles above the Earth's surface, you've got the red light and the blue light. And then green light typically is 60 to 200 miles. And then you'll also get a little bit more red light up higher. Now, I'll get into the exact reason behind that, but I got some more stuff I want to share with you. And I hope you enjoy the artwork that's kind of scattered throughout here as well. I tried to pull a bunch of really old drawings and paintings of the Northern Lights to kind of go along with this presentation. So let's fast forward a bit further. You know, we're getting close now to what the Northern Lights actually are. We've got this idea that it's kind of electrons or energy coming from the direction of the sun interacting with the magnetosphere. The rest of the world's not quite ready to believe that, but some big historical aurora events that happened. You've got the New York Railroad storm, and like it says here, sunspot credited with rail tie-up. So the Northern Lights affected energy on the Earth's surface. You can see that one highlight down on the right that says magnetic needles deflected. There's some cases when the Aurora Borealis happens that it can actually push for a certain amount of time. It can change the direction that north will appear on your compass. If anybody's played with cell phones around the Northern Lights, and I sure have, my cell phone occasionally likes to act up when the Northern Lights are going to be good because there's a lot of energy that's kind of mixing around on the Earth's surface as well. Things get a little bit wonky, but yeah. So the rail tie up here, that there was actually so much energy that came through the electrical systems that there was a fire that was started in one of the rail buildings. It was one of the switches, and the excuse was the Northern Lights caused it, which I'm sure wasn't very well enjoyed back then. There's also the playoff storm, which happened in 1941. And I don't know if there's any baseball fans out here, but this is kind of a funny story. I'll just read to you. So, oh, I've got the wrong slides going here. Hold on a sec. There we go. So first, on the afternoon of 18 September, the Pittsburgh Pirates hosted the Brooklyn Dodgers in a game of baseball. Red Barber, a well-known sports commentator, was calling the game for WROR radio. In the fourth inning, with the score tied at 0-0, the broadcast lost signal for 15 minutes. By the time the broadcast resumed, the Pirates had accumulated 4 runs. Irate Brooklyn fans phoned the radio station to complain, but they found little satisfaction with the explanation that the sun, sunspots, and the related magnetic storm were to blame for the outage. On top of it, the Dodgers went on to lose to the Pirates 5-6. So that again, you know, 1940s, we're still trying to understand what the Northern Lights are, but there's nothing that's really been solidly proven yet. There's a lot of really great theories. General public in the 1940s was not ready to accept that this playoff game radio broadcast was disrupted by sunspots and solar wind. It just probably sounded like a total write-off of an excuse. So now let's move a little bit forward into the 1950s, and this is really cool because this building here, you see the Churchill Research Rocket Range. That building is still in Churchill today. So again, not too much is actually known, even into the 1950s, about the Northern Lights, other than some ideas and concepts. We hadn't put a man on the moon yet, so there still hadn't been people into outer space. But what they decided to do at the Churchill Research Rocket Range is, it was kind of a secret story for a little while. But I recovered a declassified paper from the 1950s talking about the choice of using Churchill to launch rockets into the Earth's upper atmosphere and study the Northern Lights. This is kind of post-World War II, Cold War era. And one of the goals, as written in there, was to see if they could extinguish or control the Northern Lights. Interesting. So they fired rockets at it with different chemicals or different elements, and attempted to extinguish the Northern Lights, put them out. They knew at this point that there was a strong electrical connection, and like we discussed in the playoff storm, it knocked out the radio for 15 minutes. So you can imagine if there was a nation that had control over the Northern Lights and this massive solar phenomenon, this big electrical phenomenon, that if they were able to control the enemy's radio waves, or just, you know, fire a rocket at the Northern Lights and then it deflected the Northern Lights and then knocked out the radio waves somewhere in Russia in the 1950s, or 1960s, that could have been a pretty good thing. But that portion of the research only lasted for like a year, because they discovered very quickly that no, they can't control the Northern Lights, and no, they can't extinguish them. So research continued at the Churchill Research Rocket Range for many, many years, all the way until the 1980s. Pretty consistently, there was over 3,300 rockets launched at the Churchill Northern Study Center, at the Churchill Research Rocket Range, which is now the site of the Churchill Northern Study Center. The rocket range is still there. It's actually in pretty good shape, considering the cold desert-like conditions. It doesn't have a lot of time to deteriorate, and it's definitely somewhere on my trips I try to have us all take a peek at, just to see kind of that piece of history sitting out on the tundra, surrounded by dwarf trees, and it's pretty spooky if you ask me, but really cool. So another historical Aurora event. This is again leading us to a better understanding of what's going on here. After some of those 1950s and 60s discoveries, and also sending humans into outer space, there was kind of a consensus that, oh yeah, there definitely is this force, or like these charged particles that are coming from the sun. It's what we know as the solar wind today. So that was well established, and so that solar wind is key in understanding what the Northern Lights are. So 1989, this is kind of, you know, we're getting into modern times. 1989, March 13th, there was a massive auroral substorm. Lots of energy coming from the sun, interacting with the Earth's magnetic field and upper atmosphere. And something that the energy can get into are really long power lines. I'm sure you've all seen them. You know, the ones that are like 20 stories high, and the power lines are way over top of your heads, way up there. So in Quebec, Canada, a lot of the electricity for that part of the country is from hydroelectric dams, and the dams are way off, way remote, in the middle of nowhere, and the power lines span hundreds of miles through the boreal forest, and then eventually reaching the city. And so the electrical current got into those power lines and basically found a weak spot and knocked out power to the entire province of Quebec. About 6 million people lost electricity for 9 hours because of the Northern Lights, which is pretty phenomenal. The same thing happened in the USA. They found just in New York State alone that there was over 240 separate failures within the power grid, but because it was able to reroute itself, it never got knocked out the same way that it did in Quebec, which is a pretty remarkable thing to have happened. And the background picture in this, you can kind of see it's a satellite shot. You've got the kind of the lit up areas where there's lots of people, and then Quebec is all in the dark during that period of time. That was pretty wild. And there it is again. Excuse me. Oh wow, it's already 12:38. 1:38 your time. So I'll give you a quick description here of the Northern Lights. So the Northern Lights starts at the sun. The sun is basically creating energy, and it's constantly emitting these charged particles or solar plasma. You can call it electrons, basically out into space, not just in one direction, not just towards Earth, but in every direction out from the sun. Those charged particles, that solar wind, heads towards Earth. And I'm just gonna see if I can get my laser pointer out here. You know what? No, I'm not. I'm just gonna describe it. So you can see with this picture, you've got the solar wind flying out from the sun. And just in case you're wondering, this picture is not to scale. Not to scale. So the sun flies out, or the solar wind flies out towards Earth, and you can see the magnetic shield and the magnetic field around Earth. A lot of those charged particles, the ones that are charged positive, negative, some of them will hit Earth, and because if you've ever put two magnets together like this, the ones that are aligned the same polarity as the Earth, a lot of those particles just get deflected off into space. However, some of the charged particles they have kind of their own magnetic thing going on, and they're maybe, let's say, instead of it being positive, negative here at Earth, they've got negative, positive, and they basically collide. And if you've ever stuck two magnets together like that, they really stick together. The same sort of thing happens with the Earth's magnetic field. Instead of being deflected, those particles that are charged in that way can actually get drawn in towards Earth via the lines of the magnetic field, or the magnetic shield, or magnetosphere. There's lots of different names for the whole program. So that's essentially what you're seeing there. Now, let's go. So if you're looking towards the daylight side of the Earth, look at that. Look at the globe really closely there. If you're looking towards the daylight side of the Earth, those particles that kind of, we're doing the south-north, north-south, they come together. The particles that are coming from the sun, some of them crash down into the Earth's upper atmosphere towards Earth on the daylight side of the Earth. Now, there is technically aurora happening, not as much as on the dark side of the Earth, but there is aurora happening on the daylight side of the Earth. The reason why we don't see it is quite simply because it's daylight, it's super bright. There's no way that you could see kind of the little bit of light that's coming from that event on the daylight side. But if you look at the dark side of the Earth in this picture, and you look at the sparkly lines that are going out and behind, there's a phenomenon that's called magnetic reconnection. So some of those particles that hit basically on the sunny side of the Earth, way out, hundreds of miles off the Earth's surface. I mean, I should actually say like thousands to tens of thousands to 100,000 miles off the Earth's surface, they start to hit our magnetic lines. They can actually break the outer lines, and then those lines kind of get slung out behind the Earth. I hope everyone's enjoying my interpretive art or interpretive dance here. But basically, they get slung out behind the Earth and kind of pressed out and narrowed, and then those lines end up colliding with each other. And when they collide with each other, it's what's called magnetic reconnection. And so they collide with each other, and then it's kind of like a slingshot effect. It slingshots those charged particles back towards Earth on the dark side of the Earth. And that's what's meant to be represented by the sparkly lines that you're seeing in this picture. Those are those charged particles slinging back towards the dark side of the Earth. Now, this is where we get into the actual physical northern lights that we see. So those charged particles from the sun have made quite a journey now. They're coming back towards the dark side of the Earth. And when they get there, just going to stay on this one for a second. When they get there, they get to that height, our Earth's upper atmosphere, where you've got oxygen and nitrogen, primarily oxygen. And these charged particles come down into the Earth's upper atmosphere, and they collide with these individual oxygen and nitrogen molecules. And what happens when they do that is they basically, the electron, right, these charged particles have energy. They basically collide, they energize or excite the oxygen, and then the oxygen, in order to go back to a regular or a relaxed oxygen state, needs to release that energy somehow. And the way they do that the way that those molecules do that, or atoms do that, is basically they release color. They release a photon, and so the color is that green or the red or potentially the blue that comes out. The most common by far is green, with red and blue kind of being very rare. So I hope that gives you a reasonable idea of kind of how the whole thing happens. It's one of those things that even after explaining it, even after explaining it a lot and reading about it a lot, you kind of get the idea, but still it seems very, so that's what's happening up there, hey? It still seems magic to me, in kind of a poetic way, if that makes sense. I don't know. So this map, or this that I'm showing you here, this is looking at the Earth from the top side down. We have 3 different poles that we need to talk about when we're talking about the Northern Lights. So we've got the geographic North Pole, which is basically what our latitude and longitude, everything is kind of based off the geographic North Pole, geographic South Pole. That would also be like, kind of what the Earth's axis is spinning on would be something along those lines, the geographic North Pole. Now, the North Magnetic Pole, which is a little bit off and just a little bit up from the geographic North Pole there, that is actually where the magnetic north is. So that's what's true north on your compass. If you had a compass and it was pointing to the north, and you were like, okay, yeah, that's north, it's going to be a little bit off from where the actual geographic North Pole is. So if you work with charts or maps and that kind of stuff, you often have to basically kind of do the magnetic difference and alter your compass so that it actually shows you where true north, or the geographic North Pole, is versus the North Magnetic Pole. And then the other one that we have here is the North Geomagnetic Pole. Now, for us, that's the most interesting and most important, because that is what the Northern Lights are circled on. So you remember earlier I mentioned the Van Allen's belt, and then also how Christian Birkeland discovered that there's certain regions around the world where it happens more frequently than others. There's kind of like this hot spot for aurora activity. It's what's called the Aurora Oval, and that is centered on the North Geomagnetic Pole. It's not centered on the geographic or the magnetic North Pole, it's the North Geomagnetic Pole. Just to make things super simple and not confusing at all, we have 3 North Poles to talk about. But so anyway, the aurora is focused on that one that's off to the left, the North Geomagnetic Pole. And what that is essentially, if you can imagine the Earth as a bar magnet, and if you were to draw a line from the North Pole, the North Magnetic Pole to the South Pole, and then kind of extend those off the Earth's surface by a couple hundred miles, that is going to be where you actually get kind of like that bar magnet kind of perfect position of magnetism. Would be, it's very hard to describe. It basically, you have to extend off the Earth's surface, and then that's where you get that North Geomagnetic Pole. And then there's also a South Geomagnetic North Pole, because like we see here, the magnetic pole, the North Magnetic Pole, is off-centered, and then on the south end, the South Magnetic Pole is also off-centered. You draw a line between the two, extend it out off the Earth, and you get these North and South Geomagnetic North Poles. Simple, right? So what that does for us is it makes places like Churchill, which are actually not all that far north, it's only 58 degrees north. It makes places like Churchill a really great place to go see Northern Lights. But what we see here, this is just a simple prediction of the that came off of the Alaska, I think, Geophysical Institute website a couple years ago. But basically just gives you an idea where that Aurora Oval is. It's not centered on the north, or the geographic North Pole. It's centered on the North Geomagnetic Pole. And essentially what it is when the Northern Lights, or when the charged particles from the sun start streaming down those magnetic lines and interact with our Earth's upper atmosphere, where this oval is where you have an incredibly high likelihood of seeing the Northern Lights. That's where they interact with the Earth's upper atmosphere first. Now, what's really cool about that is we'll get into something called the KP index, which is just quite simply, it's a way of judging how powerful, how strong the northern lights are going to be or how strong the charged particles will be on a certain night. Not necessarily what you actually physically see, but at least the strength that is forecast the strength of the particles that is forecast to come towards Earth. This is just a prediction model of where that is. But within that band, it's safe to say, this is actually on a KP4 or KP5, and I'll show you that in just a minute. It's safe to say that even anywhere from like a KP0 to a KP3, you have a very high chance of seeing the northern lights anywhere within that aurora oval. I'll show you some more pictures here. This is just another forecasting thing that you can see, but basically on the dark side of the Earth, it seems to be where it's presented more, and on the south side of the Earth, or the sun side of the Earth, you just won't see it. You're also not getting as much of that magnetic reconnection, which means there's not quite as much aurora going on. So getting into the KP index, this little map here is a good one to see. So you can see that blue line over on the right hand side, it says KP3. A KP3 is, it's not the most aurora activity, but what it can do is basically you can be somewhere around a little bit north of Winnipeg, and on a KP3 there is a chance that you'll see the northern lights. But Churchill, kind of being right in the sweet spot, is going to get them anywhere from a 0 to a 3 on the KP scale. Now, if you're farther south and you get what's called a geomagnetic storm, and you get a KP9, you could potentially see it as far south as one of those many states in the middle of the country. I'm sorry, I'm Canadian. I don't know what states I'm looking at. My sincere apologies. So if you had a really high KP number, essentially all that it means is that the aurora band, I'll show you, the aurora oval that we're looking at here, the aurora oval, instead of being kind of a narrow band, which is always over Churchill, it basically gets wider and pushed a little bit farther south. And so if you had like a 1, it would be kind of like right over Churchill, about there. And then if you had a 2, it'd be like still over Churchill, 3, still over Churchill, 4, still over Churchill, just getting bigger. And then you have a 5, still over Churchill, but extending now all the way down to like Minnesota. And then if you had a 6, it's extending south of that, 7 south of that, 8 south of that, 9, you're talking almost visible potentially in Texas, for an example. Pretty wild. So that's that chart. So how's everybody doing on understanding what the northern lights are? We're at a transition here. I'm going to start talking about the legends of the northern lights, but I will just offer a very quick summary of exactly kind of, or generally what we're seeing to try and clarify all of that information. So the northern lights, they start at the sun. The sun emits charged particles. Those charged particles fly through space towards the Earth. The Earth's magnetosphere, which protects us from charged particles like that, or can protect us from charged particles like that, intercept some of those and they get deflected. Some of those charged particles get drawn in to our magnetosphere. Some of those charged particles end up on the dark side of the Earth, where there's magnetic reconnection. And then those charged particles get launched towards Earth on the dark side of the Earth. And as they approach the Earth's surface, these charged particles crash into molecules of oxygen and nitrogen. Those oxygen and nitrogen, they get excited. They need to lose that energy to go back to a normal state, and they release that energy in the form of a photon. That photon gives us light. That light gives us the colors of green, red, and blue. Kind of got the idea? I hope so. It's really fun to talk to like 400 people, but 500 people, but not hear anybody responding. I just assume you all understand and we're good to go. So something I really like to refer to with the northern lights is that they are, in fact, in my opinion, nature's most beautiful phenomenon. And they have inspired humans for millennia. You know, some of the stories and some of the legends I'm going to tell you, it's hard to say exactly how old they are. They could be hundreds of years old. They could be thousands of years old. But really interesting all in the same. So let's get started. So there's many other names for the Northern Lights or for the Aurora Borealis. And so if we can start there, Finland, Reventule, which means I've got the meanings here, which means foxfire. Greece, blood rain. France, the dancing goats. Chipewyan, Ed Thin, which basically means caribou. And there's a story behind that I'll tell you a little bit later on. And then the Sami, would be the light that you can hear. So lots and lots of different names for them. But I'll get into a few more specific stories here. So in Norway, this picture kind of depicts what's called, they're called the maids. And you can see that they've got these, they're in white dresses and they've got this blonde hair. And essentially it's said that when the northern light shines, they're called the old maids are at play. And so they're basically flying through the sky with their shimmering blonde hair, sharing that. There's also, it's said that if you wave your own white cloth at them into the sky, they'll come closer. Another one is the story of Bifrost, the Viking legend, Bifrost, or the heavenly pathway from Earth to Asgard, I believe. And so the Northern Lights, if the Northern Lights were shining in some Viking lore, that could potentially mean that there's a great warriors traveling from Earth to Asgard. And if there was a really magnificent display of Northern Lights, it could be depicted as fighting between the two. Now I've got some stories here that I'm going to tell you about the upcoming slides. So this is a story again from kind of the Viking era, which is it was a battle between the god Thor and the mountain king. If an aurora was seen to the south, it was the breath of Thor and his goats as they swept across the heavens. If it came from the north, it was the mountain king breathing down their neck. Now there's another one which is kind of interesting, which is it's people running around in the sky, dragging their pants around their ankle because they're on fire. That's a little bit more of a different one, in my opinion. But this one is quite interesting, which is in Sweden, many areas of Scandinavia, the herring fishery is super important, and it has been for centuries. And so a strong aurora display was thought to be reflections of large schools of herring returning. And so if there was a lot of aurora, a good aurora, it was kind of this omen, or not omen rather, but a predictor of a good fishing year, which is kind of interesting. I like that a lot. Now there's also Scotland. In Scotland, this is kind of an interesting one where it takes kind of something that they can't touch and they bring it to a physical form. So the merry dancers, or the nimble men, there's a story, or basically an old Scottish proverb, which goes, when the merry dancers play, they are likely to slay. Now, essentially, they're supernatural beings that are dancing in the heavens, and they'd be dancing back and forth in the heavens, and eventually they start fighting each other and trying to kill each other for the attention of a beautiful woman. Now, where that kind of steps into real life is with bloodstones. And so it was said that bloodstones, or these rocks that have little flecks of red in them, the red is the blood from the merry dancers fighting in the sky. So another one here is omens during medieval times. Now, there's all kinds of different stuff. There's all kinds of different stories about this that are super fun. In London, for example, this wasn't even that long ago. I think it was the 1600s. There was like a really red aurora borealis, or I guess no, this would have been, yeah, about 1200, 1100, 1200. There was a really red Aurora Borealis where the people in the north of the city were basically, it got to the point where people were running with buckets filled with water to try and put out a fire because they thought that these northern lights were actually like flames coming from a distant fire. There's also a story in France where on one particular day, over 900 pilgrims came to France, came to Paris, asking to be taken in and asking for forgiveness because of these dancing lights that they'd seen in the sky. So they thought it was an omen, something to tell them to go and do this. Now, some people thought that the northern lights were potentially a bad omen, as in, you know, if the northern lights were shining and it was basically a predictor or kind of like a battle scene that was to be played out in the sky above them. In Denmark, this is a little bit more romantic, which is the northern lights are thought to be reflections of goose wings, or sorry, swans. Swans migrating north, and they're trying to free themselves from the ice, and their wings are flapping, and the northern lights are the reflections of the swan wings flapping in the sky. In China, there's a really cool one that I like. I'll just read this to you. So in 260 BC, a woman named Fu Pao watched the aurora take the form of a giant dragon one night. The next day, she learned she was pregnant, and the people predicted her child would become an important ruler. The dragon became a royal symbol, and her son became the Yellow Emperor. There's also some discussion that the idea of fire-breathing dragons could have come from early sightings of the Aurora Borealis. I kind of like that one too. That's really cool. Now the Aurora Australis. So Aurora Australis, we've got the Aurora Borealis, which is the dawn of the north. The Aurora Australis would be dawn of the south, essentially. It would be the northern lights, except they're called the southern lights. Pretty straightforward. So in New Zealand, you need a pretty good aurora storm to actually get the northern lights in New Zealand, probably like a KP6. But the Aurora Australis did occur there. And there's a story that comes from the people living on New Zealand that is, you know, way back when they were kind of inhabiting the land, they're taking their canoes, taking their boats south and south and south. And one group stopped in a village, one group stopped and they decided this was where they're going to kind of make their home, or this is as far as they were going to go. Whereas a couple of other families said, no, I think we're just going to keep going south and see what we can find. And so the northern or the southern lights to them became the smoke from those distant relatives' fires off in the distance. So the kind of northern lights moving through the sky were just smoke from other people, or their lost relatives or distant relatives that had gone farther south. Of course, once you go south of New Zealand, you get into open ocean and then eventually Antarctica, and so it was very much mythical. The Inuit, the sky spirits, or the Sela Mute. I hope I didn't pronounce that wrong, but if I did, please email me and tell me what I need to do to correct that. So this, I really like this painting, but this here depicts Inuit in the sky playing kickball with a walrus skull. So depending on where you go in the Arctic, there's a number of different stories about this. And one of them is this: it's Inuit, and basically Inuit playing kickball with a walrus skull. There's another story that goes, it's actually walrus playing kickball with a human skull, which is kind of interesting. There's also the point at Point Barrow, Alaska. There's a belief that the northern lights are coming to, they're going to come down and try to take your head. And so there's a very strong belief that you should, if you're going to be out at night, you should carry a knife with you to fight off the northern lights if they come down and try to take you. Now there's also kind of a, I don't know how, I don't know, I've just read about this, but there's another story that is directed at children, you know, I'm sure many of you have children, and you try to, I know I was one of the kids that would always leave my house and say, oh yeah, I'll be back at this time, but always show up late. That was for sure me. But there's a story that goes, you know, the Northern Lights, they basically come down and they steal children away in the night. And the colors of the Northern Lights are children's parkas that have been taken away. So this is something that maybe parents would say to their kids to try to keep them from going and staying out too late. Yeah, kind of interesting. There's also, just speaking of this, there's also in Greenland, the Greenland Inuit, if the Northern Light, you know, living in a place where it could be potentially 24 hours of darkness, if you've got a strong aurora display in the middle of winter, it actually makes the landscape, especially a white landscape covered in snow, quite bright. And so good Northern Lights could be paired with good hunting as well, because they could effectively go out using the light from the aurora to find and hunt prey. Oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself there. That some of the superstitions I already told you. So another interesting one, this is a little bit closer to home for me. The Coast Salish on Vancouver Island and the Makah in Washington State. They've got kind of similar stories that have to do with small people up in the north that are hunting. And I just want to make sure I tell these stories right. So I'm just going to go to my notes. Pardon me. So the Makah, they believe that the lights were smoke from distant fires lit to cook whale blubber. The people cooking over these fires were half the height of a canoe paddle and strong enough to catch a whale with their bare hands. So what I find really interesting about that is the Inuit were people that could hunt whales and catch them with their bare hands. And there were trade routes that went all the way throughout North America. And in some artwork, some Inuit clothing or Dene clothing, there are shells that were found that can only be found on the west coast of North America, that were found in some of their art and some of their tools. And so there were definitely trade routes, and whether or not that kind of story is something that was perpetuated from a trade route, it's something that would be very interesting for me to find out. And again, the Coast Salish had a belief that it was fires from a tribe that boiled blubber near the North Pole. So it's similar, like they're similar groups very close together that have similar stories, which I find very interesting. Now, the Menominee in Wisconsin, I don't normally read off of things, but I just want to make sure I tell these stories correctly, out of respect for these groups. So Aurora as fire. The Menominee believed the auroras were torches held by kindly giants called Manabai-Wak. These were the spirits of great hunters and fishers in the northern regions who traveled to the heavens and speared fish at night. We've also got the Manitoba, Cree, and Ojibwe. So this is closer to where Churchill is, closer to where we do our Northern Lights trips. One of these teachings passed on from generation to generation is the belief that Wataway, the Northern Lights, are spirits of the ancestors celebrating life, reminding us that we are all part of creation. Their dancing forms a pathway for the souls as they travel to the next world. It is said that when we are living properly and conducting our ceremonies and dances, the spirits of our ancestors dance in the heavens. Another teaching is that the North is understood as the land of the bear, and that the bear's power includes healing. So it is said that when the bear's healing power is strongest, the Northern Lights will dance in the sky. That's pretty cool. So now, a question that I often get is, we're getting close to the end here. A question that I often get is actually about the aurora sound. So does the aurora borealis make sound? Something we have to think about is if the aurora was way up above our heads, remember 60 miles away, if it was to make a whip across the sky, would we hear that swoosh or that swoosh kind of in the wind, like wind, from that distance away? There'd be a lag of time before that sound would make it to us. Not only would it have to be an extremely loud sound, there'd be a lag of time. So we can't actually hear it as it's moving. It doesn't make sounds that we can hear. So there's a few kind of theories behind what it might be. One of them is called brush discharge. So electrical current on Earth, kind of in like small brush or shrubs or trees, kind of creating like a static electricity kind of crackling. There's also the idea that it's potentially interacting inside of our brain. There's some kind of electrical charge inside of our brain that's making like a crackling sound. That's another theory. Another one, and this is actually something I've observed, was there was a really strong Aurora Borealis display, and I was standing underneath some power lines. And like I said, you know, what happened with Quebec with the long power lines, they can really pick up that energy. These power lines were making this real eerie electric, like buzzing sound. Kind of like, if anyone's ever heard of like purple martins, kind of like that electrical sound that purple martins can make, is kind of like that. And I was like, where are these birds coming from? That no, it was like -40 and they're totally clear sky with a huge aurora display, and it was just the charge in the power lines. There's another one, which is it could just be our heads wanting to connect sound with the light, wanting to connect sound with the light, because it's such a broad experience. Anything else like that in our existence would come with a huge amount of noise, and so it's like our brain maybe wants to fill in the gap with the sound. Now, with all of that being said, there's enough times that I've talked to people who have sworn on their lives that they heard the Aurora Borealis and it made a sound. And so I still think there's some study to be done to discover what's actually going on there, and if some people can hear it and some people can't, or what exactly is going on there. It's one of the mysteries that I'd love to get to know more about. So another beautiful one is you know, moving away from some of the myths and legends is kind of inspiration into artwork and to writing and stuff like that. I'm sure many of you have heard the poem "The Cremation of Sam McGee." There's a really wonderful video online. If you just look up "Cremation of Sam McGee" and Ted Harrison, there's one that's narrated by Johnny Cash, which I think is kind of fun. But it's just really beautiful northern art, often depicting the northern lights and that kind of stuff. So I kind of recommend that as further reading, is to go check that out and go see some of the artwork of Ted Harrison with the poem "Cremation of Sam McGee" by Robert Service. And then on a final note here, why Churchill? So, you know, we run trips in Churchill. There's very good places around the world to see northern lights, but Churchill is super great because, one, it's easy to get to most of the time. If you wanted to go see northern lights in Europe, you're talking Iceland or Finland, or Iceland or Norway are probably your two best shots. If you're going to Russia, you have to go way north, like over 70 degrees north. Norway, you'd probably be okay around the Arctic Circle and north of there. But one of the big differences is Iceland and Norway, they're both surrounded by open water, and open water is kind of like a cloud generator, so to speak. And so being in Churchill, like I have down here, my bottom point, clear skies probable from January to March, because the Hudson Bay, which Churchill is on, and the Churchill River freeze up, there's very little moisture in the air. It almost converts to a bit of a polar desert. Like all the snow, most of the snow that falls in October and November and early December. And then by late December, January, February, March, there's really not a lot more snowfall, with the exception of maybe one or two blizzards that come through in that entire period of time. So that's really good. Cold, long winters with clear skies probable from January to March and early April. Fascinating people as well up there. And you know, you think about it, anywhere in the States, you can get a flight to Winnipeg, and then we sort it all out from Winnipeg up to Churchill. Churchill is really well set up. We have wonderful partners there that make sure we get a phenomenal experience. And I know this isn't true for every single trip, but in all of my Northern Lights trips, I have seen the Northern Lights. Even if it was just for one of the 4 nights, every single one I've seen the Northern Lights. So pretty good odds, in my opinion, for going to Churchill. And with that, folks, it's just a nice picture. Thank you very much. And I hope you enjoyed my presentation. And yeah, still there?
We're still here. Thank you, Eddy. We will get into the Q&A right now. We'll go for another 10 minutes or so.
Sure.
First question is it possible to predict when there will be a really good display of the Northern Lights?
That is a very long answered question. So here's the thing. Working in Northern Lights season, you can use apps like I'll get my phone out here. I've got a few apps. I don't know if you can see this, but this one is this one here. It's called Aurora Pro. Is that one coming through okay? You see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of. So it's called Aurora Pro, and basically you can use that to kind of predict the Northern Lights a little bit. But honestly, you can get an idea of when you might be getting into something like a week or so beyond, and it'll give you a KP prediction. For if you're going with the specific mindset to go and find the Northern Lights, and you go to a place like Churchill, this app is really only good, or predictors are really only good for kind of like within an hour time frame. If you're in a place like Churchill where they get Northern Lights over 300 nights of the year, you're kind of just going out, and if there's clear skies, you have an extremely high chance of seeing Northern Lights. If you get a KP 0 to 3, you have a very good chance of seeing the Northern Lights. Some of my best Northern Lights nights have actually been when it was like a 0.5 KP in Churchill. I've also had really good nights on 1, 2s, and 3s, and 4s and 5s. What the apps I find are more designed for are people that live in southern regions. You can set them up so you can get an alert if there's going to be, like, let's say you lived in Winnipeg where you need a KP 4 or 5 to get good displays there. Then you could set it up, and then if there was a night where it was a 4 or a 5, you could potentially set yourself up to go outside and see it. But even then, you need clear skies, and you need the absence of big city lights and that kind of stuff. So there are ways to predict them, but not with a great amount of accuracy. I would say if you go to Churchill, you're just in a really great place, and you just go outside at night and look up. Not to make it sound too like yeah, my job's very hard though, and I no, it is a little more complicated than that, but you can predict it within some parameters, but not super effectively.
Mm-hmm. Okay, what is the typical range of the duration of a display? So if you were out watching the lights at night, how long would a display last typically?
That is a great question, and it can last from anywhere from like 10 seconds to 10 hours, honestly. There's some nights that the group and I will go out at 8 o'clock, and as long as the sky's dark, we go out 8 o'clock, we look up, nothing, wait around a couple hours. Oh, great, some aurora shows up around 10. We go out, watch the aurora. Maybe we have, really faint aurora on the horizon. Maybe we have a big show, but it totally varies. Something that I do use a lot in my kind of planning would actually be something called magnetic midnight. And so magnetic midnight, based on where you are on Earth, you kind of have this different timing exactly for magnetic midnight. But it's when if you're here on Earth, and this is the North Pole, over here is the sun. It's when you're in like a perfect line. That's called magnetic midnight. For Churchill, it usually is between about 10:30 p.m. and 1 a.m. And so in that period of time, I can effectively say if the Northern Lights are going to show, it's probably going to happen in that window, because that's just based on the known science. That's kind of the highest probability of a large Northern Lights display. With that being said, I've had some forecast where it's supposed to be really good, but waited up for 6 hours all through that, and it was just clear black sky. Really nice stars though, but nothing happened. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, there's been a few people wondering if there's a good time of year to see both polar bears and aurora on the same trip in Churchill.
Oh gosh. So yeah, that's a really tricky one, because my question to those folks would be, knowing that you need to stand outside in the dark looking at the sky, do you want polar bears to be around? That's my question to you. But honestly, it's set up this way. There's one time a year where, I mean, there's 2 times a year that the probabilities are high. Sorry, that's the wrong thing to say. There's one time a year where the probability is very high that you will see northern lights, and that is that January to kind of early April winter phase. And the great part about that is, you know, you've got clear skies, everything's frozen up for winter, you've got clear skies most of the time, and the aurora, it's very dark at night, and so the aurora is going to be quite good. There is a possibility of seeing the aurora in the summertime. However, because we are 58 degrees north, it doesn't get dark until 11:30 p.m. And the times that I have seen it in the summertime, it's been right around like 1:30 or 2 in the morning for like 20 minutes, and then it gets dark again. It's a little easier kind of later in the season, but again, it doesn't get dark early, and so it's very hard to see. Another thing about the summertime is in Churchill, the summer and the fall are the 2 wettest seasons. Nothing's frozen. There's a lot of water. There's a lot of moisture in the atmosphere, and so your chances of it being cloudy are very high. There's also a potential to see polar bears in the summer at a distance, and a very high potential of seeing polar bears in October and November at not much of a distance on the polar rovers. It's just, as an example, in 2019, I did 37 days of polar bear season, 5 trips. We saw northern lights on 1 trip. And then in the summertime, my 2 trips, we didn't see the northern lights. And I think only one of the summertime trips we saw polar bears. But in the polar bear season, October, November, we saw polar bears on every trip. Yeah, so it's like, if I wouldn't ever try to plan a trip hoping to get like both. It would just be like a happy benefit. So if you want to go see polar bears, go in October, November. You won't regret that decision, because you're going to have a really great experience. Super high chance of some really life-changing kind of viewings there. It's the best time to go. If you want to see beluga whales, wildflowers, Arctic wildlife, that kind of thing in the summertime, then go July, August. Potential you could see a polar bear, but it's not going to happen every time. And then potential to see northern lights, but like I said, you got to be up in the middle of the night, and you're probably going to be getting up at 7 a.m. to go look for belugas. So you kind of have to weigh it. I know that having done all 3 seasons, we really put a focus on kind of what's really good at that time. And if we can get a bonus aurora or a bonus polar bear, sweet, but it's not necessarily the thing. So we kind of have to split the seasons that way.
Okay, great. And sort of along those lines, are animals affected at all by the northern lights?
That's a good question. I would suspect that animals can benefit from it that live high up there, like in the far north, where you get the 24 hours of darkness. And just like humans can benefit from it hunting, I'm sure the animals can benefit from it for foraging and hunting themselves. I'm sure there's a benefit from that. However, I don't know if there's any like negative effects, or like, you know, there's like that thing where sometimes animals can predict earthquakes, or like they know when something big's about to happen. I haven't made any connections like that. I'd be really interested to hear if anyone knows differently, because that'd be really cool to learn, but I haven't heard of it myself.
Okay. And where are we right now in the solar cycle?
The solar cycle? So that's an interesting question, because the solar cycle, I believe we're right at the bottom of the solar cycle. Like the fewest sunspots. And sunspots is not something I really touched on. Sunspots, basically they can help with larger numbers of solar flares, and essentially have more geomagnetic storms, which is what will be called the KP5s and 6s. However, I typically don't watch that too closely, because the northern lights, while they can be affected by that, it doesn't really matter being in Churchill or being anywhere in that Aurora oval, in the sense that the northern lights are still going to happen regardless. It's just there's going to be less frequency of KP5, 6, 7, where you would be able to see the northern lights a little bit farther south. And so right now we're in the bottom of that cycle, but that doesn't mean there's no aurora. It just means there's no geomagnetic storms. That makes sense?
Yep, absolutely. Thank you. All right, well, I'm going to call it there with questions. This was wonderful, Eddy. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back over to you for closing comments.
Right on. Well, thanks so much for the opportunity. It's always a blast to come and present for Natural Habitat Adventures. I'm really hoping, fingers crossed, that we can get out and find some aurora maybe next year, or if it comes down to it, in 2022. But it is by far one of the most exciting and thrilling things to watch when it does happen for you. And it's one of those things that if you do see it, you'll never forget that you saw it. It can be quite something. Yeah, so thank you very much, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, Eddy. This was such a great way to start the week. It was so interesting. So thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.